Why do these ancient predators captivate our imaginations like no other creature? How can we protect these majestic sharks that have roamed our oceans for millions of years? Despite their fearsome reputation, most shark species pose no threat to humans. Yet they face extinction due to overfishing and habitat loss. From the awe-inspiring great white to the unique hammerhead, here are 6 stories that explore their fascinating world. In the summer of 2009, the bustling seaside town of Gansbaai, South Africa, was alive with visitors eager to experience its world-renowned shark cage diving. Among them was Linda Hoffman, a 45-year-old woman from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who had long dreamed of coming face-to-face with a great white shark after watching a thrilling documentary where great whites bit into the bottom of a shark cage. Despite her desk-bound life, Linda, a self-proclaimed adventurer, had finally saved enough for the trip of a lifetime. During the morning of the dive, Linda woke up with butterflies in her stomach. She boarded the Shark Spotter, a 39-foot catamaran owned by ocean thrill seekers. During the journey, she conversed with Bob and Carol Simmons, a Florida retired couple with a great sense of humor. They laughed at how badly they told jokes and appreciated Linda's self-deprecating sense of humor. An hour or so into the cruise, the crew began chaining the water with bait to attract sharks. The smell of the bait was overwhelming. Linda wrinkled her nose in distaste, but her heart was racing in anticipation. Sure enough, within minutes, a large great white shark cruised into view, circling the boat. Bob, Carol, and another tourist waded into the cage with Linda. As they dropped the cage into the water, Linda looked into the shark's black, lifeless eyes and rows of razor-sharp teeth. All of a sudden, the shark charged at the cage. It shook the whole structure violently, leaving Linda and the others tumbled around. She noticed one of the bars had bent inward. The shark began to ram the cage repetitively, barring it further. Driven by survival instinct, Linda wedged herself firmly in place, out of reach from the shark. She thought this was over when the cage broke the surface, but the great white shark made one last desperate attempt, clamping down on its edge. The crew started pounding on the shark's nose until it relented, but Linda got stuck because of her size and could not get out. Themba, a first mate, quickly sprayed the repellent, and the shark slid backward into the water. When the crew was able to save Linda from the danger she was in, she had deep cuts down her right side from the shark's teeth. Linda was rushed to the hospital, where a doctor treated her wounds, which were not that bad. After some minor treatments, they immediately discharged her. In time, Linda's story became popular everywhere. As she recovered, her appreciation of life increased, and she encouraged people to love each moment and live to the fullest. Astoundingly, the incident did not create a phobia in Linda regarding sharks or the ocean. Rather, it motivated her interest in marine conservation. She began researching the dangers facing great white sharks and other sea creatures. She realized that the shark's behavior could be caused by stress. The incident brought about improved safety measures by the local authorities to the shark cage diving industry in Gansbaai and pushed for better ethics. What could have been a tragedy became a story of survival, transformation, and conservation. The plus-size lady from Milwaukee, Linda Hoffman, had faced one of the ocean's most feared predators head-on and lived to tell about it, walking away with a new purpose in life. In the summer of 2007, off the azure waters of Viti Levu, the main Fijian island, an unusual encounter occurred between man and fish. The deep sea near Natadola, a small coastal village known for its white sandy beaches and vibrant marine life, was typically calm, drawing snorkelers from all over. But on this day, the tranquility was broken by an unexpected event. Daniel Dan McKenzie, 38, a chartered accountant from Brisbane, Australia, had been planning a trip for several months, and now was his moment. Dan, an accountant in Brisbane, developed a passion for spearfishing in his early 20s, and often traveled to exotic locations to pursue his hobby. Dan had arrived in Fiji a week earlier with his lifelong friend and diving buddy, Trevor Holbrook. The day greeted them with shallow exploration of the reefs near the beachfront where they were staying. However, Dan was anxious to go further offshore. The deeper the water, the bigger the fish, an adage he lived by. Dan and Trevor boarded a very small chartered boat with one old fisherman, Captain Josefa Tuivaga. promising to drop them at a location with many reef fish, including big ones at certain times. As they went further into the sea, Dan started getting very excited. The water was calm and nice, with only soft waves rocking the boat. It was so brilliant blue with just a few small white wispy clouds that the day would be perfect for diving. After an hour, Captain Josefa stopped the engine. They had reached a spot he called the Blue Hole, explaining it was an underwater canyon with the huge walls of a coral reef. The depth there changed from some 30 meters to over 100 meters, promising different marine life. Dan and Trevor donned their wetsuits. Each was outfitted with a spear gun and a dive knife, and a floating line was attached to his surface buoy. The float lines marked their position and enabled them to secure fish for carrying. With a final check of the gear, the two friends slipped into the warm waters of Fiji. Visibility was good, about 30 meters to any side. Brilliantly colored tropical fish played near the reef, while larger predators cruised in deeper water. The first hour of diving passed without incident. Dan and Trevor dived in relay to about 20 meters, holding their breath for nearly 2 minutes. They caught a few average-sized groupers and snappers and strung them on their float lines. By early morning, Dan was eager to explore deeper waters after spotting some marine life in the shallow parts of the reef. At around 25 meters, he noticed a massive coral formation from the reef wall. Dan knew this feature would be teeming with keyfish. Dan sucked in a few deep breaths and duck-dived down. Just as he reached the top of the coral, he saw a cloud of fusiliers blasting away from him, most probably flushing from a predator. Then he saw it. Suddenly, a giant trevally surged forward from the deep blue water, resembling a torpedo on a mission. At first glance, Dan thought it seemed a bit small, but as it drew closer, he realized it was over a meter long and likely weighed more than 50 kilos. Its silvery body glinted in the filtered sunlight, and for a moment it seemed its large eyes were focused directly on him. For an instant, time stopped. Dan hung there, not moving, the burn on his lungs starting, the giant fish looking at him suspiciously. In what seemed an instant, the trevally exploded forward. Dan could hardly react on time. He automatically raised his spear gun, but the trevally hit him with tremendous force, throwing the wind from his lungs and spinning his spear gun into the blue. Dizzy and gasping, Dan kicked the waters increasingly, trying to drive himself towards the surface. But the trevally was not satisfying. Wheeling back, it came again, impacting his side with its broad, powerful body. The force sent him whirling head over tail through the water. Dan's lungs were now on fire for air. Black dots swirled on the edges of his vision as he clawed upward toward the shimmering light above. At last, his head broke the surface, and he gulped in huge breaths of air. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. As Dan attempted to position himself, a sudden blow struck his left foot like a sharp rake. The giant trevally had followed him to the surface and was now attacking with its powerful jaws, perhaps because his black wetsuit had been mistaken for a rival or a huge squid. Dan screamed in agony and surprise as he struggled frantically in the water, trying to free himself from the fish that had latched onto his body. His cries echoed across the waves, catching the attention of Trevor and the crew on the nearby boat as they were heading back to shore. Captain Josefa, sensing the urgency, exchanged a concerned glance with Trevor. Without hesitation, they fired up the engine and sped toward Dan. The giant trevally released Dan's leg but didn't let up in its attack. Dan watched the silverfish darting at him again and again. He had to duck below the water every time it rushed at him to avoid another collision. The aim was to reach Dan down on the boat as it neared. He mustered his last strength to swim for his friend's outstretched hand. Just as their fingers touched, Dan felt another sharp pain, this time in his right forearm. The trevally had made one last attack before relenting back to the waters. Trevor and Captain Josefa dragged Dan up onto the boat. He collapsed to the rough deck, gasping sharply and holding the injured arm. His punctured foot and forearm bled onto the thick white teak deck of the boat. While Captain Josefa raced the boat back to shore, Trevor bound Dan's wounds. The warm tropical waters increased the risk of infection, so Dan needed medical attention as soon as possible. On the way back, when the shock lessened to some level, Dan felt only pain and adrenaline and, weirdly, some sense of exhilaration. Despite the danger he had just been put in, Part of him now had to marvel at the power and ferocity of the giant trevally. It was a poignant reminder of the force and randomness of nature. He was immediately taken to a nearby medical clinic when he reached the shore. The wounds on his leg and forearm were stitched, and he was given antibiotics to speed up the healing process. Dan's epic story spread very quickly and became quite a local sensation. Dan was able to reflect on his diving accident experience. It left him with a deeper respect for the sea and its inhabitants. He realized he was an intruder in their domain who had to be careful and observant. As his holiday was coming to an end, Dan found himself to be quite unwilling to leave Fiji. The thrill of the few last days had only added further endearment to the island and ocean. He promised to return someday, maybe to have a thoroughly conducted, adventurous underwater trip. In the dead, still hours before dawn, when dreams and reality weren't so far apart, Dan could almost feel the phantom pressure of the giant trevally's powerful body against his side. He had come face to face with one of the ocean's most impressive creatures, and lived to tell the tale. During the sweltering summer of 2011, a crocodile was encountered in the Northern Territory, one of Australia's deepest rivers. This frightening incident occurred within the Mary River wetlands, about 100 kilometers east of Darwin, known for their magnificent landscapes and killing wildlife. The incident involved a 32-year-old Melbourne wildlife photographer, Emily Thornberry. She liked photographing nature, from the smallest butterfly to the largest African lion. Still, she had come to the Northern Territory because of the saltwater crocodile, Australia's largest predator. Emily went to Darwin, their natural home, searching for the ultimate picture of these ancient reptiles. She spent the first few days acclimatizing to the hot and humid weather and talking to the local guides and experts on wildlife. Everyone told her to exercise extreme caution around salties, as they called the crocodiles. One morning, Emily paddled off in a rented kayak to explore the Mary River wetlands. She opted to use the kayak because it was quiet, allowing her to sneak up on wildlife for good photos instantly. Her waterproof camera was strapped to her chest, ready to take pictures at any moment. She paddled along the shore, looking at the lavish scenery. The air was tremendously humid, with many birds singing. Above the water flitted colored kingfishers, and in the shallow water waded a family of jabiroos, a kind of stork. She didn't see much in the first few hours, but got some nice pictures of birds, and saw a few smaller freshwater crocodiles sunbathing on the banks. Still, she hadn't seen a big saltwater crocodile, a sighting of which was what she wanted to see. Emily decided to venture further upstream as the sun climbed higher. About an hour's paddle away, she had heard of a particularly beautiful bend in the river where crocodiles were known to bask on a sandy bank. Eager to see it, she paddled with renewed energy. However, as she continued upstream, the river grew narrower, and the trees began to arch overhead, creating the sensation of paddling through a tunnel. The surroundings became eerily quiet, unsettling her, but she shrugged it off, attributing her nerves to the fatigue from paddling for so long. Rounding the bend, Emily's heart jolted. She saw what she had been waiting for on the sandy bank, a huge saltwater crocodile lying beached on the shore at least 5 meters long. Its scaly skin glinted in the sun, and its strong tail bent lazily in the shallows. She lifted her camera with shaking hands. This was the shot she was after, a perfect view of one of nature's scariest predators in its natural home. Zooming in on the eye, she found it shining with some ancient predatory intelligence. Just as Emily was about to click the picture, she heard a small sound behind her. It was so quiet she might have imagined it. She turned her head slowly to look behind her. Time seemed to stand still as Emily saw another crocodile some meters from her kayak. This one was in the water, with only its eyes and the top of its nose apparent. How long had it been following her quietly? Everything happened in a flash before Emily could do anything. The crocodile jumped forward with scary speed, its huge mouth wide open. Just barely in time, Emily could scream as the powerful crocodile hit her kayak, tipping it over as if made of paper. Confused and gasping for breath, Emily fell into the muddy river. She panicked upon realizing just how precarious her situation was. She was in water with not one but two huge carnivorous predators. She remembered all the stories of crocodile attacks that she had heard. Crocodiles would drag their prey underwater and then spin to tear off pieces of flesh. With adrenaline coursing in her body, Emily kicked out unthinkingly and connected with something hard and scaly. She heard a loud snap close to her leg, and at the same moment she felt the rush of water as the crocodile attacked again. Its teeth had closed on empty water instead of her flesh by some miracle. Desperate to survive, Emily fought her way to the surface. Her lungs hurt at the intake of air as she looked wildly around for any sign of the crocodiles. She saw her overturned kayak a few meters away and swam towards it fast. Just as her fingers grasped the edge of the kayak, Emily felt something brush against her leg. Terrified, she pulled herself onto the upside-down kayak with her last bit of energy. As she tried to pull her legs out of the water, powerful jaws closed around her left foot. Emily screamed with pain and fear, and she kicked out with her free foot. With the heel connected with the crocodile's nose, she felt its grip loosen momentarily. It was enough. She got onto the kayak with one final desperate pull, crying with relief and leftover fear. But she wasn't safe yet. Furious that it had lost its catch, the crocodile was now circling the kayak, eyes fixed on her. She could see that soon enough the second crocodile was approaching, drawn by the commotion. She realized she had to get going quickly or she would probably be in the water again. She paddled hard with her hands, her shaking hands bouncing off the upside-down kayak as she pushed toward the shore. Every movement hurt her injured foot, but she kept going. The shore seemed far away, and she could hear powerful jaws snapping behind her. After what seemed to be an eternity but was only a few minutes, the kayak hit the riverbank. She crawled onto land on her hands and knees until she felt well away from the water's edge. Only then did she allow herself to collapse, her body shaking from exhaustion and shock. As she lay on the ground, gasping for breath, a burning sensation in her left foot seized her attention. Glancing down, she noticed her shoe was gone, revealing several deep cuts across her foot and ankle where the crocodile's teeth had bitten her. The sight of her blood made her feel faint, but she knew she couldn't afford to pass out here. With the final bits of strength, she tore strips from her t-shirt to wrap her blown-off foot. Then she pulled out the emergency whistle hung around her neck and began blowing. She hoped this sound would draw the attention of other boaters or even the river patrol. Finally, it had been another hour before Emily heard the reassuring sound of a boat engine. By then, she'd dragged herself further inland and taken shelter under a large tree, worried the crocodiles might follow her onto land. The river patrol journeyed in search of her, unacquainted with how she looked. When the river patrol officers finally found her, they were shocked by her appearance. She was covered with mud, blood, and scratches. Her eyes were wide and traumatized, revealing the horror through which she went. Emily was rushed to the Royal Darwin Hospital, where she underwent surgery for her injuries. The doctors were surprised by her good fortune. Despite the severity of the attack, she had escaped with relatively minor physical injuries. However, they knew that the mental scars from the ordeal would likely take much longer to heal. Ultimately, it would be left to this same sense of wonder to shape Emily's future. Though she would never again take risks with crocodiles as she had in the past, neither would she let fear dominate her life. Instead, she turned her experience to a new purpose, using her photography and story to teach others about respecting wildlife and protecting natural habitats. Over the years, she became a noted wildlife conservationist. Her strong images and personal story inspired many people to care about the environment. She worked directly with indigenous rangers in the Northern Territory, learning from their deep ancestral knowledge of the land and its creatures. What started as an experience of terror became the pivotal point of Emily's life. That moment transformed her from a nature observer into a nature defender. Hers became the story that proved humankind is only a part of nature. Even more importantly, the wisdom to respect a tenuous balance of life makes true wisdom. Cocoa Beach, Florida's sun-drenched shores, had long been a haven for surf enthusiasts and beachgoers. With its pristine white sands and consistently good waves, it was no wonder the area had become a hotspot for locals and tourists seeking the perfect ride. However, on that fateful day in 2013, the idyllic coastal paradise would become the stage for a horrifying encounter that would send shockwaves through the tight-knit surfing community. Just after noon, 19-year-old Jake Hollister, a slim, freckle-faced redhead with a mop of unruly curls, noticed something odd in the water. The surface darkened slightly as he sat straddling his board, and a nagging sense of unease crept over him. Suddenly, the water around him erupted in a frenzy of motion, and a massive gray form burst through the surface. Its powerful jaws clamped down on Jake's left leg with bone-crushing force. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, and Jake was knocked off his board into the churning water. The bull shark, driven into a frenzy by the taste of blood, began to shake its massive head from side to side, its razor-sharp teeth tearing through flesh and muscle. Jake's friends Zach and Olivia heard his muffled cries and rushed to his aid, but the bull shark continued its relentless attack. Through the haze of pain and terror, Jake remembered something he had read about shark attacks and began to punch the shark's snout and gills, momentarily forcing it to release its grip. Zach then dove off his board, striking the predator's snout and disorienting it, while Olivia struggled to keep Jake afloat and get him onto her surfboard. As they approached the shore, a human chain created a barrier between Jake and the still circling shark. On the beach, vacationing emergency room physician Dr. Samantha Reeves immediately began to assess Jake's horrific injuries, using beach towels as makeshift tourniquets to stem the bleeding. When the ambulance arrived, Jake was barely clinging to life. The paramedics rushed him to the nearby Cape Canaveral Hospital, where he began the long and arduous process of recovery. In the following days, the Cocoa Beach community rallied around Jake and his family, and the incident sparked intense debate about shark conservation and beach safety. A year after the attack, Jake stood on Cocoa Beach again, surfboard under his arm. The beach looked the same as it always had, but Jake knew everything had changed. As he gazed at the waves, a mix of emotions washed over him: fear, excitement, and an overwhelming gratitude for being alive. Jake's return to surfing made headlines nationwide, inspiring others who had faced similar tragedies. He became an advocate for both ocean conservation and disability rights, using his platform to educate people about the importance of respecting marine ecosystems while also pushing for better accessibility in water sports. The shark attack had changed Jake's life forever, but it hadn't defined him. As he stood on the beach that day, watching the sunset over the Atlantic, Jake realized that he had gained something precious from his ordeal: a deeper appreciation for life and a determination to make every moment count. In the frigid waters of the Aleutian Islands, off the rugged coast of Alaska, a chilling encounter unfolded in the summer of 2010. The remote town of Dutch Harbor, nestled on Amoknak Island, had long been a hub for fishermen and adventurers seeking the wild beauty of the last frontier. Known for its rich marine biodiversity and treacherous seas, the area has attracted divers and researchers for decades. On this day, the normally bustling harbor was unusually quiet. The distant cries of seagulls and the gentle lapping of waves against the weathered docks were the only sounds that broke the silence. The overcast sky casts a gray pall over the landscape, adding a sense of foreboding to the scene. Mark Thornberry, a 42-year-old marine biologist from Seattle, had arrived in Dutch Harbor a week earlier. His mission was to study the local ecosystem, focusing on the elusive giant Pacific octopus. Mark had spent years diving in various locations worldwide, but the allure of Alaska's unique marine life had drawn him to this remote corner of the globe. Accompanying Mark on this expedition was his research assistant, Samantha "Sam" Chen, a bright and enthusiastic 28-year-old graduate student from the University of Washington. While Sam was an experienced diver, this was her first time in such extreme conditions, and she looked to Mark for guidance and reassurance. As they prepared their gear on the deck of their chartered boat, the Northern Star, Mark went over the dive plan with Sam and their local guide, Hank Olson. Hank, a grizzled 55-year-old Alaskan native with a thick salt and pepper beard, had been navigating these waters for over 3 decades. His weathered face bore testament to years spent battling the elements, and his eyes held a wealth of knowledge about the sea and its inhabitants. As they descended into the murky depths, the water temperature dropped rapidly. Even through their insulated dry suits, Mark and Sam could feel the biting cold. The visibility was poor, with particulate matter swirling in the weak beams of their dive lights. They moved slowly, carefully navigating through a dense forest of bull kelp that swayed hypnotically in the current. About 30 minutes into the dive, at a depth of around 80 feet, Mark spotted something that made his heart race. In a small clearing among the kelp, he saw the unmistakable shape of a giant Pacific octopus. Its reddish-brown skin was textured with small bumps, and its 8 arms curled gracefully around its body. Mark signaled to Sam, pointing excitedly at the creature. As they approached, Mark couldn't help but marvel at its size. Most giant Pacific octopuses he had encountered were around 10 to 16 feet across, but this specimen was easily 20 feet from arm-tip to arm-tip. Its body alone was the size of a large beach ball. Mark noticed something odd about the octopus's behavior as they drew closer. Instead of retreating or camouflaging itself as most octopuses would, this one seemed to be watching them intently. Surprisingly large and intelligent, its eyes followed their movements with an unsettling focus. Suddenly, without warning, the octopus sprang into action. 2 of its massive arms shot out with lightning speed, wrapping around Mark's torso before he could react. The suction cups, some as large as saucers, latched onto his dry suit with incredible strength. Mark's initial shock quickly turned to panic as he felt himself pulled towards the octopus. He tried to signal to Sam, but she was already swimming towards him, her eyes wide with fear behind her mask. The octopus, seemingly threatened by Sam's approach, released a cloud of dark ink into the water. In an instant, visibility dropped to near zero. Mark could feel more arms wrapping around him, the powerful muscles constricting around his body. He struggled to reach for his dive knife, but his arms were pinned to his sides. Sam, momentarily blinded by the ink cloud, groped unthinkingly in the water, trying to locate Mark. She could hear his regulator's rapid, panicked bubbles, but couldn't pinpoint his location in the inky blackness. Mark's mind raced as he felt the octopus pulling him towards what he assumed was its den. He knew that giant Pacific octopuses were generally not aggressive toward humans, but this one's behavior was unprecedented. As the ink began to dissipate, Sam finally caught sight of Mark. To her horror, she saw that the octopus had dragged him several feet away and was attempting to wedge him into a crevice between 2 large rocks. Mark's movements were sluggish, and Sam realized with a jolt that his air supply might be compromised. Acting instinctively, Sam swam towards them, her dive knife now in hand. She knew she had to be careful. Octopuses were intelligent, sensitive creatures and didn't want to cause unnecessary harm. But Mark's life was in danger, and she had to act fast. As Sam approached, the octopus released another cloud of ink. This time, however, she was prepared. She switched on her backup light, its powerful beam cutting through the murky water. She could see Mark's eyes behind his mask, wide with a mixture of fear and diminishing oxygen. Sam began carefully cutting away at the octopus's arms, trying to avoid its vital areas. The creature's skin changed color rapidly, flashing from deep red to pale white, a clear sign of agitation. It tightened its grip on Mark, who was now barely moving. In a desperate move, Sam reached for Mark's backup air source, which was still accessible. She managed to get it into his mouth, providing him with much-needed oxygen. This revived Mark, who began to struggle once more against the octopus's grasp. With renewed energy, Mark freed one arm and reached for his knife. Together, he and Sam worked to detach the octopus's suckers from his suit carefully. It was a slow, painstaking process, made more difficult by the creature's continued attempts to subdue Mark. Just when it seemed they might be making progress, a powerful current swept through the area. The sudden surge of water caught them off guard, separating Sam from Mark and the octopus. She tumbled through the water, struggling to regain her orientation. When Sam finally righted herself, she was horrified that the current had pushed Mark and the octopus further into the rocky crevice. Mark was almost completely engulfed by the creature's mass, with only his flailing legs visible. Panic threatened to overwhelm Sam, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew she and Mark would be in grave danger if she lost control. She took a deep breath and surveyed the situation, looking for any advantage. That's when she noticed something peculiar. The octopus, despite its aggressive behavior, seemed to be protecting something. Its arms were curled protectively around a cluster of small, translucent objects attached to the rock face. Eggs. Sam realized this wasn't a random attack. The octopus was a female protecting her brood. Understanding the creature's motivation gave Sam an idea. Instead of trying to remove Mark forcibly, she began to slowly back away, tugging gently on Mark's fins. To her relief, the strategy worked. As she and Mark moved further from the eggs, the octopus's grip began to loosen. Mark could extract himself from the creature's grasp inch by agonizing inch. Finally free, Mark and Sam wasted no time putting distance between themselves and the protective mother octopus. They ascended slowly, mindful of decompression sickness, both shaken by the encounter but relieved to be alive. As they broke the surface, Hank was in the boat, his face a mask of concern. He had been monitoring their airtime and knew something had gone wrong when they stayed longer than planned. Between gasps for air and fits of nervous laughter, Mark and Sam recounted their harrowing experience. Hank listened with awe and disbelief, shaking his head at the incredible tale. As they headed back to Dutch Harbor, the adrenaline of the encounter began to wear off, replaced by a profound respect for nature's power and unpredictability. Despite his close call, Mark was more fascinated than ever by the giant Pacific octopus. Their encounter became something of a local legend in Dutch Harbor. Fishermen and divers spoke of it in hushed tones over beers at the Aleutian Bar, each retelling growing more fantastic than the last. But for those who had been there, for Mark, Sam, and Hank, the true story was exciting enough, a reminder of the thin line between wonder and danger in our world's wild frontiers. With its azure waters and sun-drenched coastlines, the Mediterranean Sea has long been a magnet for tourists seeking the perfect summer getaway. In the summer of 2023, the picturesque Greek island of Naxos, nestled in the heart of the Aegean Sea, became the backdrop for an unexpected and harrowing encounter that would forever change the life of one unsuspecting swimmer. Lisa Marjorie Thornton, a 30-year-old accountant from Manchester, England, had been looking forward to her Mediterranean vacation for months. After a grueling tax season, she was ready to trade spreadsheets for sunbathing and client meetings for cocktails by the beach. Little did she know that her idyllic getaway would take a terrifying turn. One morning, Lisa set out for a swim at Plaka Beach, a long stretch of golden sand on the island's western coast. Lisa felt her stress melt away as she waded into the crystal-clear water. She had always been a strong swimmer, and the calm sea beckoned her to venture further from shore. About 200 meters out, Lisa paused to tread water and admire the view of the coastline. The whitewashed buildings of Naxos town gleamed in the distance, and the imposing bulk of Mount Zas loomed on the horizon. It was at this moment of serene contemplation that disaster struck. Without warning, Lisa felt an intense, searing pain across her back and arms. It was as if someone had poured boiling water over her skin. In her shock, she didn't immediately realize what had happened. She had unwittingly swum into the trailing tentacles of a massive jellyfish, a specimen of Rhizostoma pulmo, commonly known as the barrel jellyfish or the dustbin lid jellyfish due to its enormous size. As Lisa thrashed in the water trying to disentangle herself from the jellyfish's tentacles, she inadvertently came into contact with more of the creature's stinging cells. The venom began to take effect almost immediately. Her muscles started to spasm, and she felt a creeping numbness spreading from the points of contact. Panic set in as Lisa realized the gravity of her situation. She was far from shore, and the venom was rapidly weakening her. She tried to call for help, but her voice came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. The beautiful sea that had seemed so inviting just moments ago now felt vast and menacing. Back on the beach, a group of local teenagers was engaged in a spirited game of beach volleyball. 17-year-old Nikos Papadopoulos, a Naxos native aspiring to become a lifeguard, was the first to notice something amiss. He caught sight of a figure in the water between serves, moving erratically and seeming to sink below the surface. Nikos alerted his friends and, without hesitation, dove into the water. His years of swimming in these waters had made him strong and fast, and he covered the distance to Lisa in record time. When he reached her, she was barely conscious, her skin an angry red where the jellyfish had made contact. With the help of his friend Alexis Kouris, Nikos managed to bring Lisa back to shore. By this time, a crowd had gathered, and someone had called for an ambulance. Among the onlookers was Dr. Elena Mavromatis, a vacationing cardiologist from Athens, who immediately took charge of the situation. Dr. Mavromatis recognized the signs of a severe jellyfish sting and knew that time was of the essence. She instructed bystanders to rinse the affected areas with seawater to remove any remaining stingers, and sent someone to find vinegar to help neutralize the venom. As they waited for the ambulance, Lisa drifted in and out of consciousness. Her breathing was labored and her pulse was rapid and irregular. Dr. Mavromatis monitored her closely. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics quickly assessed Lisa's condition. They administered pain medication and antihistamines to combat the effects of the venom and placed her on oxygen to assist her breathing. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, Lisa managed to whisper her name and nationality to Dr. Mavromatis, who promised to contact the British Embassy. For the next 48 hours in the hospital, Lisa's condition remained critical. Her body fought against the effects of the venom, and at times it seemed she might not pull through. On the third day, Lisa's condition began to improve. Large portions of Lisa's back, arms, and legs were covered in painful, blistering welts that would likely leave permanent scars. Lisa recovered days later, and she had time to reflect on her near-death experience. The incident had given her a newfound respect for the power of nature and the fragility of human life. The giant jellyfish that had nearly taken her life had, in a strange way, given her a new one. Lisa Marjorie Thornton, the accountant from Manchester, had discovered a purpose she never knew she had, all because of an unexpected encounter in the azure waters of the Mediterranean.